1 Corinthians chapter 15 has to deal with the resurrection. And so we're in Advent, Christmas time, and obviously we talk so much about the incarnation, but you really can't see the incarnation without looking at the resurrection. And that both of those are bookends to the work of Christ that becomes our hope, our peace, our joy. And so when we look specifically at 1 Corinthians 15, even though we're going to talk about resurrection, and normally we talk about resurrection during Easter time, but you can't see the incarnation without the resurrection. You can't see the resurrection without the incarnation. Both of those are held together. So even though we're in Advent, it's the perfect time to also talk about resurrection, because it is the summation. Both of those together paint the picture for us for what it's like to see and to hold and to experience the work of Christ. So with that in mind, last chapter, I'm going to finish it today. So I got a lot to go over. So 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Let me give you a little bit of context so we'll kind of have somewhat a good frame going into the text. Now, there's so much inside the Corinthian book, the letter, that is contextual to the situation that Paul is addressing. And inside of Corinth, one of the things that was a struggle amongst the larger people in that area was, is there really a resurrection of the body? Now, the church community inside Corinth didn't have too much of a problem believing that Jesus was resurrected, but there was a line drawn in what does it mean for us, or what does it mean for humans. And the real issue is over the body, physical body, not the body of Christ or the body of the church, but is the body resurrected as well? And some of it stemmed from the background of the church contained two thoughts, one Jewish and one Greek. And they were different when it came to how they saw immortality, how they saw the body, things of that nature. Inside the Jewish context of the church, you're familiar probably with the terms Pharisees and Sadducees. They did not agree on the same understanding of resurrection. The Pharisees did believe in an afterlife. The Sadducees did not. And so there's this line of thought inside of Judaism that denied the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the body. And now keep in mind, Sadducees, maybe some of the priestly class, but obviously a very wealthy land-owning portion of the Jewish culture. Pharisees were more of the very conservative laity of the church. You might remember, I think it was either when we looked at 1 Corinthians, I know it was when we looked at the Gospel of Mark some time ago, we talked a little bit about, and with C.S. Lewis we did, heaven and hell and the different terms that are used. One of the terms that is used often in the New Testament to describe some level of afterlife is the word Sheol. Now, you probably have heard that word before. It does not mean hell. That's what it's not. Sheol really is a Hebrew word that means sort of like vast, gray wasteland. And we really don't know 100% what it means, other than it's not the best of place to be. And so, there was in this line of thought, at least inside of the Jewish culture, at least one strand that didn't believe in afterlife, and another strand that did, and to some aspect of it, Sheol is a part of it, or can be a part of it. The other part would be is that obviously people would be in the presence of God. But in the Old Testament, we really don't get a fair amount of information on anything when it comes to resurrection. It's not as defined as it would be in some of the other theological concepts. Now, on the Greek side of the church, obviously the Greek side believed heavily in the immortality of the soul, but they struggled with the fact that anything that was physical, made up of matter, could be redeemed or could be resurrected, because Greek thought considers matter evil, or just secondary. And so what develops in Greek thought, and this would have influenced the church in some form or fashion. Remember, people outside the church coming into the church, they believe that inside the person was some level of a divine spark, for lack of better words, and that when the person died, the things that are physical or made up of matter would obviously decay, and that divine spark, that part that is immortal, would go back to God. Now, Paul's view of the resurrection is different than both of those. Both the soul and the body is or was resurrected. The body's not evil, that is the physical body. And his rationale, as we get into the text, is that it can't be because of the incarnation. I mean, what do we believe about the incarnation? This is why Christmas and Advent and incarnation is important. One of the theological truths that comes out of that is that out of the incarnation, if Jesus literally is God and human, and the idea is not like it's a schizophrenic Jesus where he's 50% God over here and 50% human over there, and he sort of kind of goes back and forth between each side. The idea of incarnation is, if you can imagine this, the black being God. All right, who stole my green one? All right, here we go. All right, and the green one being human, fully God, fully human. That's the theological understanding behind incarnation. Which means then, if Jesus was physically human, then that opens up a whole different category that the body must be good. You with me? Oh, sorry. Thinking of baby. Sorry. I'm caught up on incarnation. Thank you. Perfect. That the body must be good. Does that make sense? So, which means that opens up a couple of questions for us then. How do we treat our own bodies? I mean, we've already gotten insight into the idea that you are the temple, and that's in part of 1 Corinthians is plural. You, as in plural, you. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit, and then you also got you yourself. Now, when we talk about that previously in Corinthians, it does not. It's not using. It's not. We don't know if it's talking about physical body or not. But if you add in what Paul's going to talk about in 15, then you can at least make some levels of possibilities that at least the body, according to Jesus and according to Christian thought, is good. Just something to think about. So that's the context behind this all. All right. So let's get into the text and kind of flesh this out. If someone would read for us 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11.
Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, and then to the 12. After that he appeared, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also, into one abnormally born, as one abnormally born. For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, whether then it was I or they, this is what we preach, and this is what you believe.
Thanks, Betty. So what Paul is doing is he's beginning, to set this stage of what he's going to talk about when it comes to an understanding of resurrection of the dead, more specifically a resurrection of the body physically, and so he's laying out at least some introductory remarks, and inside these introductory remarks, what we have is, what he's done is given us a summary in general of the good news as a whole as experienced by the Corinthians. Notice that in the beginning he talks about the good news comes to them via Paul's proclamation. The Corinthians receive it. He says that in verse 1. Notice I proclaim this to you. In turn, you received it. So it's sort of like this joint commonality of, I got the good news and you got the good news. And the good news has been effective in both of our lives. And it's something in which all of us, I mean, when I'm talking now, I'm talking about Paul and the Corinthian church, but you definitely can make the same case with us. All of us are being saved, are being transformed by it. Now, Paul, often when I read Paul's letters, I don't know if he's suffering from a guilt complex or if he's just constantly having to defend his turf, and it could be, maybe a little bit of both. But he gives a little bit of information about what Jesus Christ has done as being the foundation for the good news. Jesus Christ has appeared to Peter. He talks about that in the text. We know that also from Mark chapter 16. We also know it from Luke chapter 24. But then he also talks about something about Jesus appearing to James, the brother of the Lord. Now, I really have to stress this for a minute. This is of vital importance when it comes to it's one of the conditions that I think leads to a high probability that you literally can believe what the Bible says about the resurrection. All right? Who obviously, James, the brother of the Lord. When we meet James early on in Mark 3 or in John 7, is James a believer that Jesus is the incarnate God? No, he's not even close. Mark describes him actually as one who's literally saying, Mom, you need to be careful. The townspeople are saying that he's out of his mind. You remember that story in the Gospel of Mark? And we agree. Just think about how many of you got siblings? All right. What if you came home on, Christmas morning, and you open up the scroll of Isaiah and turn to Isaiah chapter 61, and you read that it's now the time of the Lord's favor, and God has now proclaimed release to the captives. God has proclaimed good news to the poor. To the blind, they will now see. Again, this is a time of great jubilee because of what God has done with the Messiah. And then you roll up the scroll and you say, oh yeah, by the way, family, it's fulfilled today in me. How do you think that would go? I mean, it's Christmas morning. It'd be appropriate, right? I mean, that's, correct? I mean, it's what we're... Pardon me? Well, I mean, do your boys always listen to everything that you've said and done everything that, they listen. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, well, give it a go. Let's see what happens. I mean, y'all can let me know how it works in January. Well, my brothers think that already. So, I mean, they're watching, right? No, but I mean, you think about it just on some relational terms. Can you imagine? Here, they've grown up with Jesus, right? Which means they've watched him grow every day, and to now he's an adult, and he stands up one day and says, "Oh yeah, by the way, I'm the Messiah." Yeah, that's right. I mean, now you know where we get to in Mark's gospel when they say, this is the first Mark-in sandwich. You remember that? That's when it first happens in Mark's gospel. They think he's crazy. It would remind me of Joseph and Sure, same thing. Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, but You have, I mean, who's around the cross when Jesus is resurrected? Any of his brothers? None. All right. So, when you look at it on one level, you got James pre-resurrection is fairly is pretty much dead set against the fact that his brother is the Messiah. Post-resurrection, what do you find? Not only believe, James is a leader. All right, so you have to ask the question then, what caused the change? Now, we can play devil's advocate, and we could say, well, maybe he wanted to use his brother as a meal ticket. Maybe they were going to get rich from this. But all of the disciples died horrible deaths. They were not wealthy individuals. So to be able to stand on the line and say, I'm going to use my brother for my well-being, was a death sentence. All right. So you can just draw some conclusions from this. Paul's another good example. You also have in the text, not just that he appears to James, but that he appears to Paul. Paul, when we meet him, is he a fan of Jesus? Absolutely not. And so maybe this might explain if there is a guilt complex. All the different things that Paul is wrestling with what he did before he meets Christ. All right. Now I want to stop for a second. This isn't in the text, but this is worth. By the way, how did our Georgia Columbus person do on Jeopardy?
She won 2 nights in a row.
Wow, fantastic. All right. Did any questions come up about 1 Corinthians?
You know what? The first part was something about the Bible,
And
Scott Boyce swore he was her Sunday school teacher, so that's why she got it.
yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So we all take credit for that one, right? So wonderful. How many people are haunted by past sins? Yeah, probably about everybody. That's about right. Then Paul is your best friend. All right. I mean, so don't miss some of the contextual issues that live in the text. See, we have a tendency to approach the Bible as people who these are like heroes of the faith or extraordinary people. No, they're not. I mean, these are people who floundered on so many things, even when it comes to their relationship with other people or their relationship with God. And so you have living examples of what it's like for people to receive forgiveness, for people to live into forgiveness, for people to fully embrace grace. I think it's fairly convincing that it's a high probability that Jesus, even though we weren't there in the tomb to watch it happen, that Jesus really was resurrected. When you start to look at some of the larger dynamics that show up in the context, particularly you've got James, his brother, ardently against him. All of a sudden he's the biggest fan. Same with Paul. And I mean, there's others, about 7 or 8 different other examples that you can pull. Why would the early church base their testimony on women? In that day, that's stupid, because it would not hold up in court. And if you're trying to convince people of an airtight case, you don't go and find women. All right? You find people in their culture of great status. And yet, but the early church doesn't change the message. I mean, there's a number of these things that you can see that even though what you can do is you can paint a very high probability that what we read about when it comes to the resurrection is true. I mean, if not, then, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people are just flat out dumb. Well, what are the odds on that happening? That's pretty slim. So, I mean, it's, you see Paul is starting to build this type of argument to talk about resurrection, at least when it comes to Jesus. And then he's going to make some application inside to what that means for us. So let me stop here since we've talked about a number of things. Go ahead.
Is there any other religion that's ever claimed?
There are some other religions. It's not as I mean, I know Buddhism has, people are resurrected in their teachings all the time. I'm not sure you can paint the same probability because it doesn't have as much historical information that shows up like it does inside the scriptures, or the Christian scriptures. So,
Are they resurrected or
incarnated, reincarnation. Yeah, no, there are a few writings that talk about some of the leaders actually resurrected. But then they die again, and then that's it. But it's not on the, it's not as many writings on that as you would find here, and or as so many that shows up inside of Christianity. But it's not often, and all of them die again. So that's a.
And they didn't.
Yeah, they didn't ascend, and so we in the Western Church don't put a lot of, but we put a lot of stock in the ascension. We just don't talk about it as much. In the Eastern side of the church, the Ascension Day is as important as the Resurrection Day. Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, that type. The part of the church that stems out of Constantinople, which we don't have it. Yeah, it is. It's right here. Yeah, and Istanbul, that side of the church. The church splits between those two over basically control, and theologically over a preposition. Does the Holy Spirit stem from God only, or does it stem from God and the Son? And one side of the church said from God only, the other side of the church said from God and the Son, from the first person and the second person. And so they actually have a nasty riff. And so one has a pope, one has a emperor, but they're still share 99%. They're just disagreeing on a couple of small things.
The Eastern Church is still, at least in our contact with it, they're very mystical.
Right. Yeah. Very much so. From day one too. The Western side of the church is heavy. Just heavy logic based, and mainly because of people like Augustine and some of the early heavyweight theologians that come out of that, Tertullian, things of that nature. The Eastern side of the church, you're 100% right, has a fair amount of mystery. And they're comfortable with leaving it with that. They don't try to explain everything. And so a lot of symbols, like icons, even in the worship service, the censers and the smoke and, and the smells and whatnot. And they just leave a lot to just, all right, it says it this way. We're not going to try to tell you how that works out. And there's there's at different times, there's some comfort in that. I think the church today, at least the Western side, and we would be in the Western side of the church, has a fair amount of, and this comes out of the age of enlightenment, 1800s, coming out of Europe and whatnot. Maybe we have some guilt as well that we have to explain God's existence. And for instance, how many of you get upset whenever you feel like someone has said something ugly towards God and you feel compelled to go and tell them how wrong they are? All right? It happens. We got to explain to everybody that God is real. Well, really? Does the God need you to explain that? Maybe. In the Western church, we feel compelled to do that. In the Eastern church, they would just say, well, all right, good luck to you. Seriously. Salvation for them sits inside the walls of the church in the dirt. And very Old Testament understanding of salvation, and so there are some differences, but they don't explain. They do explain a fair amount, but on some of they're also very comfortable with mystery, if that makes sense. All right, good question though. All right, so anything else in the first 11 verses before we move on? All right, if someone would read, we're going to break up this next section because it's fairly long, 12 through 19. Okay?
Now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is and those also who have died in Christ have perished. And not for this life only we have hope in Christ. We are of all people most to be pitied.
So what we have here is Paul is now moving his argument from just some basic introductory remarks of setting some stages around who Jesus is, what Jesus has done, and the works of Christ. Now he's starting to get into some of the actual issues that were plaguing the church, the ones that we talked about in the very beginning, about how, is there a resurrection of the body, the different backgrounds behind the church, Jewish understanding or Greek understanding, and so he's setting the stage that Jesus has been resurrected, which means then his body would have been resurrected, and then that'll set the stage for is if his body is resurrected and we are in Christ, then would not our body be resurrected as well? So let's keep going. If someone would read now verse 20 through 28. All right.
But Christ really has been raised from death, the first one of all those who will be raised. Death comes to people because of what one man did, but now there is resurrection from death because of another man. I mean that in Adam all of us died, so in the same way in Christ all of us will be made alive again. But everyone will be raised to life in the right order. Christ was first to be raised. Then when Christ comes again, those who belong to him will be raised to life. Then the end will come. Christ will destroy all rulers, authorities, and powers. Then he will give the kingdom of God. He will give the kingdom to God the Father. Christ must rule under God. Christ must rule until God puts all enemies under his control. The last enemy to be destroyed will be death. As the scriptures say, God put everything under his control. When it says that everything is put under him, it is clear that this does not include God himself. God is the one putting everything under Christ's control. After everything has been put under Christ, then the Son himself will be put under God. God is the one who put everything under Christ, and Christ will be put under God, so that God will be the complete ruler over everything.
That's it. Yes, ma'am. Now this particular portion is really addressing the issue around the Jewish understanding of resurrection, mainly borrowing some of the concepts. You've heard of first fruits, in the Old Testament. You see this in the Passover. You see it also in Leviticus chapter 23 with the feast of unleavened bread, and then the closing of that with Passover itself. The idea is the person would bring their first fruits of the harvest into the priest. The priest would then take them and either you normally would wave them before an altar as a sign of, here, God, we're bringing our first fruit as of who we are, what we're doing. And then at the same time, it was of hopes of a blessing for the harvest to come. And so Paul is picking up on this line of thought in Judaism around the idea of if Jesus is the first fruit, the first of what else is going to come. Does that make sense? In the resurrection, Jesus resurrected first. That's the first fruit. And then obviously those who are connected to Jesus, that's going to be sort of like the harvest that is to come. So again, if Jesus is resurrected, body being a part of that, we are connected to Jesus. He's already talked about that in the very first, remember, in verse 1, 2, and 3. I bring the good news. What is the good news? The good news is about Jesus. We have all received it. It helps us to stand. It helps us to overcome. Then he talks about how it's gone to different people. It's gone to Peter. It's gone to James. It's gone to me. It's gone to you. And so now, if Jesus has been resurrected, this is how it took place with him. We are connected to him via the good news, via faith. Then obviously, what happened to Jesus will happen to us. Do you see what I'm talking about? The logic behind all that. It's almost like a math equation, isn't it? Remember the distributive property? Isn't that where? Let's see if I can work that into. Today's lesson. I think the distributive property is this, where 3x plus 3, I don't have that fully worked out yet. Just give me some time while we're talking. That'll work into resurrection, I can promise you. So, but what you have is, I'm speaking as if I'm Paul, and to the church at Corinth, we have the gospel. And because we have the gospel, then we're in Christ. And so what happens to Christ happens to us. That's basically what Paul is saying throughout these verses. And if what happened to Jesus, hang on, I think I said that wrong. What happens to Jesus happens to us. And if what happened to Jesus is resurrection, then we can trust that that's going to happen to us. He is the first fruit of the resurrection. And so we are to come afterwards. Does that make sense? It's not, don't see it, you can, even though it would logically make sense, but he's not trying to give a time context as much as a theological context. It would work time-wise here. Obviously, Jesus has been resurrected. The people that he's writing to has not been, but that would make sense. But, he's not trying to paint the picture of this linear, concept of history that says, all right, God, we don't, infinity, and then, then Jesus, and then Jesus is resurrected here, and, here we are, and then we're going to be resurrected there. I mean, that would make sense here for those readers, but that's not necessarily what he's trying to get at. He's picking up a theological analogy that brings in this Old Testament understanding of first fruit. This happened, and then if it did happen here, then obviously it would happen to us as well.
Yeah, I think about that like I'm in him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what is sort of in resurrection?
All right. Well, that's why I was mentioning the time concept. So good. I'm glad you caught that. You have been redeemed. So I mean, from earlier where you missed the children. So the idea is what she's talking about is sort of what we talked about on Sunday, the now and then component. And if is it possible to be, and it would be correct. I know it's possible because I'm going to say, if I say it, then obviously it's possible. But would it be correct in Christian thought to say we are in the very moments of resurrection now, and we will be resurrected in the future? That's what Sally is getting at. Is that true? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it might be your body that's going to be
Well,
at the end.
and part of it is that's harder for us to understand because we are linear people and we see time linear as well. There was a time where I wasn't born. I'm born. I live. I die. Time goes on. And you always have to keep in mind, and I realize this gets deep into the deep side of the pool. God is outside of time. It's almost, for God, everything is now. And so the concept of resurrection is we are being resurrected at this very moment because we are being saved at this very moment. We are being transformed at this very moment, and we will be resurrected and we will be transformed in the future as well.
Somebody just read that Tom said, because of Adam we were dead, but then because of when we believed in Christ, because of that we were alive.
Right.
So we have been resurrected. Is that what you're getting at, saying that our spirit is
Right.
come back to life?
Yeah, part of the Adam concept also comes from the Old Testament understanding in Jewish thought that in Adam everybody sinned. All right, that's not 100% endorsed in all sections of the church and the Christian church. Others would say in Adam we now have the propensity to sin, but we don't do the same sin that Adam and Eve did. Does that make sense? In Jewish thought, Adam and Eve bite the apple, then all of us bite the apple. It's collective. In Christianity, you've kind of got a split on that. Some would say yes, and they would follow the Jewish theology that comes out of the Old Testament. But there's equally enough theological thought around the church that says, Adam and Eve bite the apple. We didn't bite the apple because we weren't there, but because we have a propensity to bite the apple. And even though we didn't bite that exact apple, we will bite an apple at some point in our life, which means then that we are under the same curse of sin. All right? You get to the same ending. We're all in trouble and we need help. It's what's the first cause? Is the first cause, Adam bites it, and so everybody bites it. That particular, it's outside of time and space. We are collectively biting the apple. Or, what's that? Well, but inside of Christian thought, that's what you have. Adam is also the word for humanity, and so what we're getting into now is was there a first Adam, or is Genesis 1 a story of just humanity's nature?
Or was it somebody's fault?
Right.
Carrying blame.
Right. Well, so you get a little bit of that, and it ends with the same place. We all bite something, and it ends up being self-rule. Now, whether or not we're all guilty because Adam did it, and so there's this collective guilt, or whether or not because of what Adam does, what humanity does, we're going to bite our own apples at whatever time we are alive and living and whatnot. We still end up with a place where we're in need of redemption and we're under the curse of sin.
And the snake.
Yeah, well, that's part of the story too, So does that make sense? The issue is who actually does the biting, and when the biting took place, and what are the full ramifications of it. For instance, a good example would be if Connor goes and does something, I don't know, whatever, holds up the quickie mark or something, I would be punished for what Connor did. That's one line of thought. Right. That's one line of thought. And the other line of thought would be Connor holds up the quickie mark. He's punished for what he does, but inside of me is the same character that will hold up the quickie mark the next time I'm in the quickie mark. But I'm not held accountable for his actual actions. Does that make sense? No, they're just two strands that live throughout the church. One is more Jewish. One is probably just developed early on in the church. I don't know the origins of them all. I just know the idea of the collective guilt comes down from the Jewish line, and it would make sense here that Paul is addressing it because he is also addressing one of the part of the context of first fruit and some of the different understandings of the what we would probably call the Jewish Christians inside of the Corinthian church. On one level, we're splitting hairs, okay? So I don't want you to get too but it fits inside of the pericope, the little passage that has to deal with Paul addressing first fruits and some of the theology that came out of the Old Testament that was alive inside of Corinth. So, personally, that allows me to, when I read into this, I want to see that, I interpret that in line of the Jewish understanding of in Adam we're all guilty, because that was a prominent thought inside of Jewish culture. And they're coming out of that inside the church. But, but you can find in the church an equal part that says, we're not held, we're not guilty for what Adam did, but given the same situation, not only would we have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because otherwise you're saying there could be somebody that, or us that didn't bite the apple, are free of sin. We know that's not true.
God was the only sin. If you interpret Adam not as a literal Adam, but as in humanity, in Genesis 1, then humanity wants to be God, and that is the issue. So humanity is guilty. Okay, a lot of it has to do with how you see the Genesis 1.
I feel like if I had been there, I would have.
Right. Which then puts you on the side of the church that says, I'm not guilty for what Adam did, but I know inside of me is the same propensity to do exactly what happened. So again, I want to stress, we get to the same place. The origin of it, there's evidence on both sides. Yeah, I mean, that's what, I'm not trying to, I don't want to get us bogged down here. So.
Well, we know that there's not a human being walking around that doesn't have the
The propensity,
expectation of self somewhere.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the proof does show up in the pudding of humanity that, no one has to be taught to sin.
No,
I mean,
something else out there that's teaching us.
Even, listen, you can take out the whole, pay attention to what happens in Genesis. The Ten Commandments have not been given. So there is not a moral code for people who follow God. That doesn't come till Exodus, okay? All right? And so,
Well, that was one.
what was that?
We eat off that tree.
Yeah, and then,
One.
but then what happens? What happens throughout all of Genesis? What do you find in Genesis? Yeah, I mean, you've got murder, rape, depravity, darkness. I mean, you've got a little bit of everything. Yeah, I mean, you've got people acting out of self-will for self-benefit, and we don't. You can make a case. If moral code is not given until Exodus, right? I mean, it's not like they had 10 Commandments, or moral code in Genesis. They didn't have it.
But in the beginning, when they were first there, and
They're told one thing: don't eat. You can eat of everywhere, just can't eat of that one. So that's the only command that's been given: don't eat. All right. Now, so throughout the rest of Genesis. Okay, now what happens? Adam and Eve, they're kicked out of the garden, and then angel blocks entrance in, and so everybody else is free to do whatever. They're not even in the garden, right? So they didn't even get that one command. So they're free. No, because what we discover in Genesis is that we don't have to be taught how to hurt, how to destroy ourselves, other people. To me, the greatest, we don't talk too much about this. I think one of the best covenants made is with Noah. The fact that God didn't flush the deal is amazing. Because what does Noah do as soon as he gets off the ark? Yeah, he builds a vineyard, gets drunk, and it's downhill ever since. I mean, it's like, seriously. And so, we are good at doing that. And so whether or not it comes from Adam, and we're all in the boat because of Adam, or whether or not it comes from our own self and we have our own propensities to do that, both of them end in the same place. We are in need of redemption. And what Paul tells us is that Jesus is resurrected. We are connected in Christ via faith, and that what happens to him happens to us. Okay? Let me take a break. 7 minutes. And if you would use that in your prayer times. Also, I have the refreshment list, so we're good there for at least a number of weeks. And then we'll pick it back up, pass it around at the first of the year just in case things have changed. Okay, now we're going to move into this portion of Scripture that's probably one of the most difficult passages to understand in all of the New Testament. I mean, it's a top tenor of difficulty, mainly because the Greek, there's so many nuances in the Greek language, and particularly when you talk about possessions, the genitive case of nouns, trying to figure out exactly, and what actually is the possessive part. But really, what's most difficult to interpret so often in the New Testament are prepositions, and depending on how you define a preposition, I mean, it could be fairly significant. And in this passage, you're going to see one of these cases. So if somebody, excuse me, if somebody would read verses 29 through 34, we'll dive into the difficulty. The one who's not eating cake and everything else.
Now, if there is no resurrection, what will those do who are baptized for the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, what are people baptized for then? As I glory over you in Christ Jesus our Lord. If I thought wild beasts in Ephesus for merely human reasons, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. Come back to your senses as you ought, and stop sinning, for there are some who are ignorant of God. I say this to your shame.
Okay, thank you. So we have this concept of, just FYI, this is not in the text, but Nan Kanzi's, Drew's, their baby it's on its way. It's coming as we speak. So she has went into labor. So Nan and Mike Kanzi will have a new grandchild at some point today. So excited news. All right, that showed up in verse 34a. Okay, so get back to the text. You got the idea of this, baptizing. What's the verse? Verse 29. Otherwise, what will those people do who receive baptism on behalf of the dead? What is that? Yeah, they added it. Yeah, comes. That's probably not a bad question to find out when. You have different texts, Greek texts, and some of them look different than the others. But we think this is original. This is not one. Most time when you have an addition, it has an asterisk and says some varieties or some texts have something else or whatever. But the main issue is on that one verse. Otherwise, what will those people who receive baptism on behalf of? That's one preposition. Does anybody's Bible have something different than on behalf of?
Well, mine just says if the dead will not be raised, and what point is saying people will be baptized for those who are dead. Why do it unless the dead will someday rise again?
Okay, what version do you have? Is that a paraphrase?
I've got the New Living Today.
Yeah, all right. And then you've got someone interpreting that and then give an insight. All right. Does anybody have something around the idea of above or over the grave or over the dead? All right. Well, good. But that could be this is the Greek preposition. It can be interpreted one or two different ways. It can mean above or over, or it could be instead of or on behalf of.
What's the first word?
Uper. The H you don't. Uper. It's a preposition in the Greek, and it can be. There are times in the New Testament where it's above. There are times in the New Testament where it's over, and there are times in the New Testament it's something to do with instead of or on behalf of. And so, with this being the interpretation, and it could be a little bit. I mean, it could be either one of these. We've just got some speculations for what was going on in the early church. And there are a couple of them. If we interpret this to be, if Paul meant above or over, then a proper interpretation could be that people literally were baptized over the gravesite. Now, keep in mind, churches weren't around until the 300s, around 350 or so. So when we read the book of Acts, they met in graves or in cemeteries. They met on beaches. They met in people's homes. They met outside by creek beds. And one of the common practices in the early church that we do know from biblical writing and non-canonical, non-biblical writings is that people would often worship at places where what they considered to be holy people had died. Does that make sense? And so, they didn't have a nice little font with a marble floor and a nice little mosaic and an altar and invite people up in the worship service and ask them the vows of baptism and then baptize them at the altar and then they go sit back down in the church. They didn't do it that way. So when somebody wanted to be baptized, well, you baptize them either in the creek or in the ocean or wherever. And so there's one school of thought that says that perhaps they were meeting at a holy site, someone who was, maybe, the Apostle John died, or no, he didn't die, he was on an island. But let's just say, Andrew dies. And we know that he died X place, and so a community of faith would meet around his grave site, and it would be considered holy to them. And so whenever somebody was coming into the faith, baptism was a part of it, they baptized that person over or above the actual grave. That could be a plausible interpretation. Does that make sense? And we know this was a practice. So it could very well be that what he's talking about is people literally baptizing over your grandmother's grave or your great-granddaddy's grave who was a great Christian, and you meet out there a couple times a year to have a worship service, and
Were they thinking they were going to absorb some of their greatness?
No, it could, who knows? I mean, that could be another question to ask. We don't have the answer to that. If we interpret this to be above or over, it has more to do with the physical place. They literally are just over the grave. Like I'm standing on a carpet, and there's a building. Well, great-granddaddy Shane died, and he was a wonderful Christian, and so, I'm going to baptize Connor over great-granddaddy Shane's grave.
And they were sprinkling.
Well, it could be. I mean, obviously you couldn't dunk, right. I mean, so we don't have insight into that. I mean, but that would make it's hard to dunk in water when, unless it's a naval burial, I guess. I mean, well, hang on, we ain't gotten that far yet. You're going a little bit too fast. This is, if it's above or over, it has to do with physical proximity. All right? So, but that could be a possible definition. And it would definitely give some explanation to some degree. If it's an instead of or on behalf of, then it gets more tricky. Because you could have people who were coming into the church and you also had people coming out of the church. And so, you could have people who are literally, Shane is scheduled to be baptized at 2 o'clock on Sunday, May the 10th. And Shane decides that he doesn't want to, and so Becky takes his slot. All right? That's not a plausible definition or a plausible explanation, but that is at least one explanation of what could take place. Because remember how people, they didn't, at some point around this time, they developed catechisms. All right, you know what that is? That's the process by which someone enters the church. And so, in some places it was an annual, just a one-year deal. Some years it was, some places 2 or 3 years. And so the idea is they would come to the worship service, they would participate in everything but the Mass, the communion. That was what was most important. And so they'd be asked to leave. And so they could not participate in that. That was considered sacred insider knowledge. And so you had to wait to make sure that you understood the elements or the theologies and whatnot behind the faith, say yes to it, were baptized, and then you could go and participate. Then you're a member. Member rights, right? Now you're in the club, you got the full rights of it all. And so there were thoughts that what if there are people who are going through that process, they're going to be baptized, they at the last minute say no, someone else who's been in the process jumps in, takes their place. That's one thought. The other thought would be, still in this idea of instead of or on behalf of, is that someone, this is getting into what you're talking about, someone's coming into the faith, they're going to be baptized, they were influenced by someone who's already dead, they get baptized at that person's gravesite, and in hopes of some of it rubs off. Does that make sense? And so almost like baptism via proxy. All right. And now that got further developed in the idea that Becky is, Becky's going through her catechism. She dies before she can actually be baptized, and so you have a sister, you have a brother. Okay. Ruth normally sits by Becky. Ruth loves Becky so much, Ruth gets baptized via proxy for Becky so Becky can get access to Jesus. That's another possibility. All right. So,
a lot of people, I think that.
well, to some degree, that's what we do with infant baptism. So it's not far-fetched. Okay. I mean, infant baptism is parents stand in the gap for the person to make covenant contracts with God. God makes contracts with the parents. We don't. It gets a little sticky when you start talking about as the person gets older and things of that nature.
That's a parent's job.
Well, right. Well,
Standing in the gap.
Would it be even? Well, let's just kind of stay with parents. What if child dies during the middle of confirmation year? They're going through catechism. They don't have a chance to be baptized, so parent gets baptized on behalf of or instead of child.
Yes, but that's a long road.
I know it, but I'm just giving you some scenarios. Another scenario.
A lot of it has to do with what baptism actually
Sure,
does,
sure.
what it means. But it's appointed for us to die once,
Mm-hmm.
and after that the judgment. So forget it.
Forget what?
Baptizing somebody is
Okay, so forget. Yeah, okay. Well, all right, but that's you're also looking at it from 2014, and from my point is.
we're looking at it from their point of
Yeah, I mean, get back. I'm looking at it from what are some possible scenarios of going on in Corinth at their day, and so and we've got 2,000 years of Christian practice, church practice, theologies to kind of parse through to kind of help us with this. But if you're in 50 A.D.
And the Jewish thought was that they went to it.
Right. Sure. Purgatory has not been developed yet as a concept. That doesn't come around to around the 400s or so. And so, but you've got a number of things of, what do you do? Just on, I mean, you know where case law comes from? Case law develops when we've got laws, something happens outside of that we haven't dealt with, so now we got to write a new law to now deal with this, okay? Is this case law? All right, you got people coming into the faith. Well, what happens when, from the time they're in the practice of catechism and study, they haven't been baptized yet? I mean, what do we do with, from that period? And somebody dies.
They didn't even have a Bible.
They have some scrolls that hadn't been, they didn't have what we have. So what happens? I want to hold on to that question in just a second. What do you do? How do you baptize? Do you baptize them dead? Sometimes they did. Do you baptize it via proxy? Okay. I mean, so, my point is we don't know specifically. I'm just giving you some options of how to interpret the text. It's very difficult to understand, and depending on whatever view, the easiest view to explain, though probably the most unlikely interpretation, is the proximity one. Because then you're...
I've always thought it meant because I trusted Apollo, or I trusted.
Well, so, but see...
I trusted James who's already dead, or whatever.
But you're getting into on behalf of.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Right, which then has a host of theological variances that, and rabbit trails to follow. I think that I would agree that this is probably the more correct interpretation of the word. All right? It just doesn't make the waters clearer for us theologically. But for whatever, what we do know is Paul is addressing some form of practice that is going on inside the Corinth church that might just be lost to history. Obviously, it's not practiced today. Outside of if you did, maybe the beginnings of infant baptism.
They probably did a lot of spooky things because.
Well,
What do you think?
well, who knows? We do some spooky stuff. I mean,
Well, right. Right up the road.
I don't know where I heard it. Someone had explained it, that section to me one time as because Christianity was so new, they looked at their grandparents and their great-grandparents, and this was very important to them, but they hadn't had a chance to become Christians.
well, that's you also we haven't talked about the concept of household baptisms yet, and in the there, for instance, the Philippian jailer. What is that? Acts 16. Well, Paul and buddies are in the jail. Earthquake. They could leave. They don't. Jailer says, "How come you didn't leave? There's something different about you." They tell him about Jesus Christ. He accepts faith, believes. They go to his house. Everybody's baptized. Well, not everybody did what the dad did, but you have a practice in the early church that, and some of it is based contextual upon the way the society is. Well, obviously, whatever the alpha male decided, that's what took place. So, like when Cornelius is baptized in Acts 10, everybody, all of Cornelius, spouse, children, slaves, servants, you name it, because they all belong to Cornelius in various ways. Same with the Philippian jailer. And so, there was a practice of household baptisms that, for us here 2,000 years later, highly influenced by the Protestant Reformation, mind you, which means everybody individually has got to make their own confessions of faith. That is 100% Protestant. All right? There are other sides of the church that would say, yeah, we're all in it, but there's some mystery that is not as defined as the way we would like it as Protestants. And, so you could have some of that going on. Household baptisms.
Did he say, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you'll be saved and your household?
Right.
I choose to believe that.
Well, it's okay. Well, then
I like that.
well, you're exercising some, some non-Protestant, you're getting into some larger views of theology than just the little part that belongs to the Protestant church. Does that make so? Gene, your point is well made. That this could be instead of, or on behalf, more like on behalf of, where you have whoever is the decision maker for the household saying, "We believe we're all going to be baptized, and we're going to remember all those who are part of my lineage who have died, and we're going to baptize proxy." If that makes sense. I'm not saying, listen, I'm not advocating any of these. I'm just trying to tell you what are some of the possibilities for the text.
Yeah, but it's still in that, and it causes a lot of
Sure, I mean, it's all over. I mean, it's a
discussion,
heartburn. Yeah.
arguments, and everything. But didn't Jesus, once he came and all, didn't they kind of clarify what baptism is, so that it is a personal decision to be
No.
dead and buried and resurrected?
Well, I mean, you've got the idea of, you have the idea of baptisms being practiced even before Jesus' day. Jesus adds baptism, into baptism by the Spirit. Later on, after his death, you have one of the what we call the rule of faith. You mentioned people didn't have the Scriptures. One of the ways that they taught the faith was via the Trinity. And so you have very early on baptism in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so that begins this whole concept of what you're getting at. But in Jesus' day, it wasn't, and even into the early church, it is not as clear and well-defined as it is now. And that's not a bad thing. Some of it we just don't know the contextual issues. We have to guess at it. So when we read the text, we're trying to, deduce what was going on to the best of our ability, considering the information that we have. And for us, we're 2,000 years after the fact, where we have a lot of practice and a lot of theology that influences us. And sometimes we take it to be true even though it's not. For instance, Away in the Manger. You like that one? And we're just totally bent on the fact that no crying he make. How many babies didn't cry? There's a whole bunch of legend stuff that is developed over Jesus, with, playing tricks on his mom, and it's goofy. And, didn't want to take a bath, moving the water.
By then he wasn't a baby. How old? I know they say, look, I'm thinking the Lord, with that song, maybe how old was Jesus when they?
Oh, you mean when the wise men come, he's a little toddler probably. The way the text reads for the wise men, the Magi, is that they see the star and it stops. Well, that's when they begin their journey. Well, to walk from one place from over there traveling would have taken a long time, and so he would not have been a baby. So even what we bless and sanction as a nativity-looking scene is not scripturally accurate.
Sure is sweet, though.
What? Oh, well, it sure is sweet because it makes us feel good. But it's not, it's not one of those things that is, it's okay. It's not that big of a deal. But right, yeah. And shepherds, they go that night. But whether or not the angel was sitting over the little cutout house and the shepherds coming at the same time, that didn't take place. The angel appears to Mary and to Joseph months before. The angel appears to the shepherds. The angel leaves. We don't see the angel anymore. Well, maybe, but it's not in the text, okay? My point is, there are a ton of things that we just sort of sanction, and we adopt it as practice. And, even the way we take communion. Communion was more a communal meal. It wasn't break the bread, sip out of the cup, or dip it, or, whatever. And it wasn't grape juice. So,
Do you think Jesus didn't dip?
Jesus, well, it says he does dip the bread in, as part of the Passover. But, yeah, so it's good for us to do it. So, well, all right, to follow your...
Also ate. They were eating and...
Right, communal meal. That's part of, the Passover is a communal meal, okay? And so, but we, just over centuries of practice, we just,
I'll give you an example, a personal example of a church and intractability of what you're talking about, these kind of things. When I was getting married to the second wife, my mother, she had left the Catholic Church, right? But her
Right.
parents were very religious to this day. And she was not going to get married in the Catholic Church, but her mother insisted that there was going to be a priest present at that wedding.
right.
Well, the Archdiocese of South Florida said, there ain't going to be a priest here unless you get married in a Catholic church. It didn't have to be one down the street. It had to be one in the diocese, right?
Right.
And that was intractable. Well, that was just a big, huge anything, right? Because Chris was insistent, Karen was insistent, and nothing was happening. And the church couldn't pay the church at that time. They thought they could, well, anyhow, so somehow or another, she got one of her brothers who was the monk, in one story I've told before, who knew, he was very religious, he knew a few Catholic priests that were in a different diocese.
Right.
Well, these priests came down there, and they couldn't do the communion, but they could wear the collar.
Right.
And they could do the service, and so everything worked out fine. But it was a huge, I mean, it was so strict you would not have.
Well, and part of it,
wasn't gonna happen.
the issue is who pronounced them married.
Yeah, and that was,
All right. I mean,
that
if
was
it,
but he wasn't in the diocese.
right, and so I mean, there's when you start to, well, yeah, exactly right. So, what,
That would be sort of a blessing. But anyway, anyway, the point being was it was amazing how rigid everything was about what was
right. Well,
inside the church at that.
and so.
Might be not that way now, but it was.
Well, I mean, and it's don't. I mean, we're joking to some degree, but it's that there are certain denominations that won't accept other denominations' baptisms all the time. All right, and so I mean, there are certain denominations that you can and cannot take communion, and you have to take communion a certain way. All right, and so and now all of it is based on a theological lens. That's not bad. Okay, it's not to say, well, they don't do it our way, then something must be wrong with them. The issue is when you've got 2,000 years of, artifacts. I don't mean artifacts like digging up pottery, but this instilled way of life and belief. All right, that happens. And some of what is the beginning of artifacts for the early church in Corinth, well, it just doesn't make it to today. And so we look at this and we look back and think, gosh, they're either baptizing over a gravesite or they're baptizing via proxy for all people. And we say, well, we can't do that. Well, okay. They would probably look at some of our practices and say, wow, y'all have made this more complex than what it has to be. Because behind it all, I'm just going to have to go real quick through this last little part. Behind it all, and all of this is contingent and hinges upon the resurrection of Christ, soul and body. And if it happens to Jesus, it happens to us. Does that make sense? And so when you get into this last part, some of you ask, how are the dead raised? The next question, okay, if there is resurrection of the body, well, what does that look like? How's that going to take place? When's it going to take place? And so Paul gives us insight. That's the remaining part of the chapter. He begins to talk about it. It's the analogy of a seed. Again, that kind of first fruit concept. You bury the seed, it dies, it rises up, and it's different than the original. I mean, if you look at the rose that's blooming, it looks different than the rose, the seed. Make sense? And so the resurrection is still in the same line, the same vein, DNA, things of that nature, but it just looks different. Same seed, same life, it's just different. And so you got people, they die, they dissolve, then they rise, and they rise differently than what it was. Now, we don't know what that is. We get a little bit of insight. Corruptible is not corruptible, dishonor, now honorable, natural, future context of it. What was weak is now is power. What was natural, now spiritual. But we don't get a lot of insight into what that looks like. And, which means you have to be comfortable with some level of it not all being explained. But behind it all, ma'am? Right. It is changed. It does talk about being transformed. And, listen, I hope I'm resurrected like the David statue. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, that's what I want. So, I mean, it's, but we don't know, okay? I mean, but what we do know, it's good. And it does involve body. All right? Well, it could be. That's a good analogy that a lot of folks have used. But we don't know We don't know what happens when, we have small amount of information that we trust and believe, and we can make very good, educated guesses with high probabilities, okay?
But that's us trying to explain.
Right. Something, well, it's also something you're trying to explain that you have not experienced.
Well, anyway, I think we're gonna like it.
Well, I mean, but the bottom line is, in the end, we know it's going to be good for us, okay? That was my next step. My next step is, when you get to the very end, you got some poetic languages about, being fit to inherit the kingdom of God, and being prepared now for then. So now Paul did operate with some of the other first century folks that the end times was coming quick. They would have expected, they would have been surprised that second coming has not already happened, and they thought it was just right around the corner, which influenced some of their writings. I mean, when you've got people, like when it came to marriage, hey, if you can be single, be single. We know that the end's coming pretty soon. But if you can't, that's all right too, just as good. But, if you can, all right, that's fine. If you can't, that's fine too. But the end's coming. So, and we know that's just not it just didn't happen.
Well, it is for all of us.
What?
Coming.
Yeah, well, it is. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, it is, eventually. And so, but, yeah, who said that? Thanks. Yeah. But the whole crux of this whole chapter is very good. And basically, Paul, the way it kind of flows is, this happened to Jesus. You received Jesus in the good news. So what happened to Jesus will happen to you. And so you're right. It's going to be good. And so there's an idea, like we were getting into the Thessalonians, we don't grieve as if we're people without hope. There was in the early church, there's a host of non-canonical writings of people, they would use the terms or something similar like they accept death as just the next phase of life. And that's heavily influenced by their faith. You had people who would just welcome it. Not, someone went and sought it, like martyrs, but some would welcome it as in, St. Francis, the song "Brother Death." Where not the song is not "Brother Death," but when he, what's this song of St. Francis that we sing in the hymnal? But Sister Moon. He welcomed death as if it was his brother. All right. So now that you are ready for Jeopardy on 1 Corinthians, go in peace and may the Lord bless you. We will pick up in January with Exodus. So if Exodus is what we're going to look at next, there's a couple of things you can do that would probably be interesting. Go see the movie God and Kings. I haven't seen it yet. God and Kings is a movie that's come out where it's an interplay between Moses and Pharaoh. I have not seen the movie, but it would be just a wonderful context to make comparisons on when we actually get into the text. And read the book of Exodus. All right? The way we read, remember this, it's been a long time since we started, read all the way through, out loud, without stopping. If you can't, read, go into, read up to the Ten Commandments out loud, then start from Ten Commandments, read through out loud without stopping. All right? Okay, go in peace. May the Lord bless you. Merry Christmas.